Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I'm going to be reading a Malazan poem, specifically the epigraph to chapter 2 of Reaper's Gale. This is book 7 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This is a poem that, as I was reading, simply struck me with its beauty and its suggestiveness in terms of some of the big themes that run through the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I will start by reading the poem and doing an interpretation that will involve no spoilers whatsoever for the series. Just be looking at the poem itself. And then when I finish that, I will discuss some of the possible implications for the chapter that follows. So there will be spoilers during that portion of the video, but that will be toward the end of the video. And I will give you a warning before I begin that. So without further ado, let's read the poem. It is called Winter Reflections, and it is attributed to Korara of Dreen. So first thing I'll do is I'll read. It's a very short, lovely poem. The waking moment awaits us all, upon a threshold or where the road turns, if life is pulled, sparks like moths inward to this single sliver of time gleaming like sunlight on water. We will accrete into a mass made small, veined with fears and shot through with all that's suddenly precious. And the now is swallowed, the weight of self a crushing immediacy. On this day where the road turns comes the waking moment. Okay, that is just a lovely little poem, and it is very, what I will call Eriksonian in many ways, not least of which it suggests some of the important themes, as I said earlier, in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But just stylistically, as I read these epigraphs, the poems that are epigraphs in the series, you begin to notice certain things. Certainly he does not use rhyme normally, but he has a nice sense of rhythm that is on display in this poem as well. And he does like to use some repetition to reinforce some of the important words, so we'll take note of that as we go through a line-by-line analysis of this poem. So let's start at the beginning. The waking moment awaits us all. And by waking moment, this is a key phrase here in the poem. I take that to mean some sort of revelatory or epiphanic experience, some kind of revelation that can happen to anyone because it awaits us all. And that suggests that at the moment we are asleep, that there is something that we haven't quite realized, that we are not awakened to. So there is this moment of revelation, of epiphany that could happen to anyone. And it suggests, the phrase waking moment suggests that it could happen suddenly, and that it could be instigated by some sort of catalyst. And that is elaborated on in the next line, upon a threshold or where the road turns. These are very deeply symbolic places. A threshold, the entry point into someone's home that has all kinds of really important connotations, the threshold, where we enter into someone's home. We enter into a certain realm, if you will. And so it is a place of transition in many respects as well, the threshold, if we're taking it metaphorically. It could be if you're leaving one's home, you are leaving the comfort and the smallness of one's home into a broader, bigger world where all kinds of things can happen. Or if you're on the road and there's a sudden turning, that suggests a difference, a new path. So this both are very heavily symbolic of a new journey. And so this suggests that this waking moment has big reverberations. But there are probably certain conditions upon which this waking can happen. And one is that we see here, if life, in the third line, if life is pulled, sparks like moths inward to this single sliver of time gleaming like sunlight on water. I had to keep reading because that's just so beautiful. But what happens here? What provokes this waking moment at this significant time and place? If life is pulled, I love that way of putting it, pulled. That suggests that there may be some external force that is part of this revelation, that is part of this epiphany, something that happens to one from the outside that provokes one to see things in a new way. And this next part is really wonderful in its ambiguity. Sparks could be a noun or it could be a verb in this case. If it's a verb, it suggests ignition, right? Again, probably relating to that revelatory nature of this experience. But sparks like moths inward. And that suggests a kind of a fluttering of thought that takes place within the mind, perhaps. A journey within to this single sliver of time. And that is a lovely bit of alliteration there that carries through the next line with the sunlight, and perhaps suggesting that this epiphanic moment can happen very suddenly, in a single moment, of revelation. These words like gleaming like sunlight on water, just lovely, because it suggests the gleaming like sunlight on water is like the sparking. It's like when you see the sunlight reflecting on a river or on a lake, and it shimmers and it almost leaps out at one. That again reinforces the nature of this revelation happening at once and suddenly. This gleaming like sunlight on water. There's this dappled play of light as the water bends and with its waves and with its flow. So that's just lovely. And then we have the word accrete is a curious word here. We will accrete into a mass made small. And there's a bit of an oxymoron here, or a paradox here. We will accrete. Now, accrete, of course, means to become enlarged by smaller and smaller parts coming together. Very interesting. So there's a plural subject here. We will accrete into a mass made small. And that word small is a curious thing, because you think of accretion and you think of something getting bigger. And this is just rich with suggestion. And the idea, perhaps one idea being the plurality of this, suggests that there is more than just the singular I, more than just the ego here. And this is where I begin to see a big Malazan theme, because when I read the series, I often think of how it reinforces the view of the individual as part of the collective. It gives you these epiphanic moments when you realize that you are not alone. You are connected to the life all around you. And so if we are accreting into a mass, that suggests a plurality made of individuals. That suggests that the individual identity belongs to something much larger than the individual self, than the ego. But at the same time, we are accreting into a mass made small. And that suggests that even as an aggregate, even when we are all accreted together, that we are still small. There is something much larger than us, and that perhaps we are part of something vast, much vaster than we can even conceive. And so even, of course, on the individual level, there is a fleetingness to our existence. There is a sense in which our individual self is the blink of an eye. But even when we are accreted, even when we are gathered together with all those like us around us, even then we're not such a big being. So I really love that. And then it continues with veined with fears and shot through with all that's suddenly precious. And again, I think this reinforces that theme, to me anyway, of the individual being part of the collective, and the realization of one's fleetingness, of one's ephemeral nature. because veined with fears suggests that once we realize our unity with the collective, with the much bigger energy all around us, that might create in the individual some fear of non-existence, fear of being swallowed in something much vaster, much larger, and shot through with all that's suddenly precious. And that again, you realize how precious, when you think of yourself in the vast scale of things, you realize just how precious and beautiful these small moments that our lives are composed of just are. You like the people we know, the memories we have, all these little things. We are afraid to lose them in this vastness that is surrounding us. But at the same time, the realization of this vastness gives these memories, these people, these connections, a certain preciousness. And to me, there's a real beauty in that. And yes, there is fear of mortality, fear of not being, fear of the vast darkness swallowing one. But at the same time, it is a bit of a paradox, but I believe that this can also give one a sense of just how beautiful and precious all these little moments that our lives are composed of can be. And this continues with, and the now is swallowed, the now being the moment. This now, this very moment, this fleeting bit of life is swallowed in the immensity of the eternity around us. And we feel a sort of, yes, the preciousness, but also, it's, as it says, the weight of self, a crushing immediacy. And again, that word immediacy suggests this moment right now, our fleeting moment, this immediate moment. And we feel this sense of attachment to the self in this moment, even as we realize our participation in something much larger, the vast dance all around us, of which we are a part and always were a part, like the wave on the surface of the ocean. We're a small wave, but we're really always part of that ocean. And it continues finally with a bit of lovely repetition, reinforcing the immediacy of the revelation on this day. This is the moment of our realization of being part of something much bigger than ourselves. So on this day where the road turns, and there's a repetition there from the second line. So we have a kind of a mirror here looking back. The second to last line, the penultimate line, repeats part of the second line. Where the road turns comes the waking moment. And we have again repetition of the very first line, which begins with the waking moment. And the last line ends with the very same words, the waking moment. And this reinforces the cyclicality of all of this, because every individual who has ever been has had or has the potential to have had this revelation, as if we were all part of some vast cycle. And that's part of the revelation, the realization that we are not alone, we are not individuals, we are part of this collective, this we, but even that we is part of something even bigger. And that is a truly beautiful and humbling and slightly frightening realization, I think. And all of that is so wonderfully captured in this poem. So that's what the poem itself made me think about. And in terms of its relationship to the Malazan series, I'm going to talk about a few spoilers now. So if you are someone who doesn't want to hear spoilers at all, and you haven't read this far in the series, then you might want to stop watching very soon. But I do thank you for watching up to this point, and I hope that you will read Reaper's Gale, which is an incredible book, just like every other book in the series. But yes, let's talk some spoilers now. Specifically, there is one that goes back to Midnight Tides, and this has to do with the phrase in the second line of the poem, upon a threshold. And this immediately made me think of a significant moment near the end of Midnight Tides, where you have Troll Sengar standing on the threshold of Serenpetek's home. And the gesture of offering, I think it is a sword, is in the Taist Idor culture loaded with significance because it is basically that's the way in which one becomes betrothed. That is a marriage proposal of a sort. So that is something that happens near the end and that is part of the Taist Idor culture. Now, this word threshold is rich in that sense in and of itself, as I suggested earlier, but in the Malazan context, it also takes on that additional meaning. And Seren is a character in the chapter that follows. So I don't think that's an accidental connection there. And it is, of course, marriage is the union of two individuals into a whole. So you take two separate entities and you bring them together into something that is a whole. So that certainly does fit with the overall theme of the poem. Now, in terms of the chapter that follows the poem, there are several character threads that run through chapter 2. There is the group that I mentioned, Seren, and she is with Silchas Ruin and Udanas and Kettle, and there is Fear Sengar with them, and they are fleeing from Fear's brother, the Emperor Rulad, but they are also after something. They are seeking Skabandari Blood Eye, and for different reasons, for different motives. And so they are on this quest even as they are being pursued. And they come across in this chapter the Kachain Chamal ruined city, which was assaulted by dragons in very, very ancient times, although Silchas has some insight into that incident. But there are several things that happen in their thread, and one of them is Uranus talking with Fear, and the two of them are not getting along very well. There are definitely echoes of certain earlier parties in the Malazan series where you have individuals thrown together who are not at all fond of one another. So yes, I did think of Felicin and Bowden and Hiboric from Deadhouse Gates, but other parties as well. And the quest groups are not always happy. They're not always happy to be together. But Udanas reminds Fear that what he has always believed in is a narrative that is in many ways just made up. And this is a moment of, I think, revelation for Fear. Fear doesn't seem to be very receptive to this revelation. And certainly Udanas is a bit bitter in imparting the revelation. But nevertheless, there is this sense in which Fear is being told how he belongs to a much bigger narrative than the one he had come to believe in. The chapter also includes a bit of Karos Invictad and Tanal Yathvanar, and these are two really odious characters. Both of them are odious for slightly different reasons, but they are just awful characters. And this is a chapter with one of their victims is screaming in agony as he's been tortured and dragged across a courtyard. And Karos delivers this lecture to Tanal Yathvanar, his assistant, about the smallness of the individual in a way that is very indifferent. Karos is someone who sees other human beings as mere tools and regards them with indifference to their pain and their suffering. A bit of a sociopath, frankly. And at the same time, Tanal Yathvanar is really no better than Karos Invictad, and he is engaging in his own private torture of a victim, a scholar named Jonath Anar, who has written various heretical tracts and has given heretical lectures about personal responsibility and the necessity for compassion. That's a quote. And that really ought to send all kinds of echoes through the minds of Malazan fans, this treatise by Jonath Anar, her theme, if you will, which is regarded by the authorities, such as Tanal Yathvanar and Karos Invictad, as moral relativism and dangerous. But Jonath, even though she's in a situation of helplessness and could be seen very much as the victim in this situation, she, in a sense, takes control by showing Tanal Yathvanar what he is and continuously referring to him as little man. He is an individual who thinks of himself first and foremost, and thinks of himself. He has this ego, which he is very much attached to, and thinks that the satisfaction of that ego is more important than anything else. He is not awakened. He is a rather pathetic individual, and she shows him what he is. As helpless as she is in that situation, she shows him what he is by calling him little man and getting into his head. So that is a pretty powerful scene in that sense, and it is related to that theme that is introduced, I think, in the epigraph of our being small and part of something larger. And many people go through life not wanting to believe that, wanting to believe that they're the most important thing in the world, and that their ego satisfaction is more important than anything else. And you also have a perspective from Brol Handar. He's the Taist Idor representative in Dreen, and his task is to sort of, I guess, oversee things, although he doesn't feel particularly relevant to what's going on. But it's an interesting moment for him as well, because he sees the similarities between the Laveri and the Taist Idor. Similarities that he never perhaps would have seen earlier, and that allow him to understand just how small both peoples are in the grand scheme of things. You also have the introduction of Red Mask in this chapter, who is returning to the owl people. And this is very much relevant to the ideas of the individual and the tribe, and the unification of the owl as well. So his thread also fits in with that theme that is suggested by the epigraph. And finally, you end the chapter with the where we began, another cycle perhaps, but with Saren and Kettle and company. And Kettle delivers this very haunting revelation about how the Taist Idor have been manipulated by the crippled god, and that he is the real force behind the Idor. Again, reinforcing this idea of the individual's smallness, and even the tribe's smallness. And Kettle alludes to this vast wheel that keeps turning. And that, again, suggests that we are these tiny little bits on this vast wheel, and that we don't have a whole lot to say about what happens on the wheel as a whole. So, yeah, this is the theme that I always think about when I'm reading the Malazan books. And this poem, which I consider to be very haunting and beautiful and meditative, really brought it home for me. This theme of our place in the vastness, our connection to all that is around us, which is at once it's humbling and a little bit scary, but also beautiful, I think. Ultimately, perhaps, the prevailing feeling for me is one of beauty and acceptance. But so another beautiful meditative poem by Steven Erikson. And once again, I do highly recommend that you read these epigraphs and give them a ponder, because they can add so much to the experience of these books. And they certainly have for me. So I'll be back later with some more thoughts on Reaper's Gale, certainly, when I have my discussion with AP Canavan. Both of our spoiler-free and our spoiler-filled discussions once we both finish the book. And perhaps I'll be back for another poem reading as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching this. Until next time.